Hi, this is Craig Stevens again, and we're talking about structural dilemmas again. Last podcast, we were talking about figure SD5 on the Westbrook Stevens website. And to get there, you go to westbrookstevens.com/organizational.htm. Now, we're talking about underuse and overload as a structural dilemma. Those are things you have to balance, right? So I was saying you have to fully engage the employee. And the point I was going to make in the last podcast is you can tell an immature project manager by how hard that person is working related to everybody else on his project. If that person's working really hard and everybody else is not, then that's a sign of immaturity in the form of the leader. Remember, every time you talk about management, you're usually talking about people, and every time you talk about people, you got to be talking about leadership. If you're in charge of those people, you're paid to get results. You're paid to inspire people to do things, and that's called leadership. Let's go a step further. It's a sign of a poor manager is that person's working so hard and the other people haven't been fully utilized. So underuse versus overload, there's got to be some way to balance that, right? So let's see. The next point on this slide, SD5, is use managers as backup and quality control. This is just a suggestion. The managers need to be able to be supportive. There's John Maxwell talks about the law of the lid, where the supervisor can be the lid over people, right? And so people can never get better than the supervisor will let them be. Well, you got to turn that around so you're actually lifting up people and they're better at what they do than you are as a manager at what they do. And your role becomes supportive in nature, and it becomes a backup to them and helping to arrange the overlap, and you're not necessarily there to do all the work. You're there to get results and inspire people to get results and to have the best productivity and best quality. Now, you should hold yourself back as quality reserve in some of these cases, where you can go in and fill in the gaps and bring people around and leave yourself open. Don't overwork yourself to the point where you can't see if you're getting good results or not. Now, the last bullet says don't continuously overload, and we talked about that in an earlier podcast. So let's go down to the next slide. The next slide in the structural dilemmas slides would be lack of clarity versus lack of creativity. All right, two extremes. Highly organic organization, what do you expect to get? Maybe a lack of clarity. And that would be, think about adhocracy versus bureaucracy. Okay, lack of clarity in adhocracy, lack of creativity in a bureaucracy. Lack of creativity in a or lack of clarity in a highly organic structure, lack of creativity in a heavily mechanistic structure. So you got to find a balance, and sometimes the balance means you balance structure and culture in different ways. Now, if you don't, well, the two extremes kind of go along this way. There's a usefulness and a wastefulness. There's a now and there's the future. There's in front of you and there's the behind you. There's bureaucratic and there's autocratic. There's rigid and there's impractical. So a lack of clarity means you're not getting enough goals and vision in front of the people. Lack of creativity means you've got so much control that people can't do anything that's creative. And in the 21st century, you got to have clarity. You got to have a little clarity. You got to have a little creativity. You got to have a lot of both. So how do you do this together? That's the dilemma. You have to figure out how to do this together. That's slide SD6. So on slide SD7, and I left that open because this is the reason. It's a case-by-case basis. You got to look at what's going on, and you got to balance. And it's not an easy answer. It's a lot of trade-offs, and we got to look at those trade-offs to make that decision. Now, here's another dilemma. Excessive autonomy versus excessive interdependence. And if you look at the picture, this is kind of how it works. You're trying to be effective, and you have a little cluster of people and then one person off to themselves. That's excessive autonomy, is the person off to themselves, and the cluster with the too much overlap is the interdependence. They have to depend on each other before they get anything done. And excessive independence is bad, and excessive autonomy is bad. Think of it this way: organic versus mechanistic. Where do you expect mechanistic? That would be excessive interdependence. Organic, it would be the excessive autonomy. And so they both have problems, and they both have good parts to it. Somewhere in the middle is what we're trying to get. Isolation. Too much autonomy, too much isolation, and those people can become bored and lonely. Redundancy. Too much independence, you're too redundant. Distraction. Have that word down there twice for a reason. You can get distracted if you're too interdependent, and you get distracted if you're too autonomous. Autonomous is you're trying to look for other things to fill your social needs, and on the interdependent side, you're looking for ways to interact with these people, and that becomes your work. Social issues become your work. One is very wasteful, and the other can be too. But one, for example, too much independence is very wasteful, and then too much isolation can be wasteful too. But it would be more in isolation. You'd become more unable to be effective, maybe. Now let's go to the next slide. That was SD7. So now we're at SD8. I'm scrolling down and I'm looking at the screen. Too loose versus too tight. Now that makes sense. Where we expect too loose, organic organizations. Where we expect to be too tight, mechanistic organizations. Where we expect it to be too loose, autocratic, adhocracy organizations. Where we expect it too tight, more autocratic or bureaucratic organizations. Now, holding things together is good. That's why you're trying to bring things together, right? You're bringing control together. But holding things together can be stifling and can hold people back from reaching their potential. If you have it too tight, people go around trying to break the system. Now, I used to explain this when designing configuration management systems. You can create a configuration management system that will not allow critical changes to be made without going through all kind of hoops, and that's good because configuration management is important. We had two major accidents that drew a picture of how important it was. One was a Challenger accident where procedures were changed in order to get the flight up, but at the same time they had to change the procedures to do that. In Bhopal, India, things were changed outside of their specifications, and it killed hundreds of people. So if you have too tight of a system, then your people will go around the system and break the system. So it's like not having, as an example of configuration management, make those systems too tight. It's like not having configuration control at all, not having change control at all. You lose control if it's too tight, and you lose control if it's too loose. You have higher risk if it's too tight, and you have higher risk if it's too loose. Employees get lost if it's too loose because they don't know what to do. It's not tight enough. So these are some of the examples. You got to balance these in order to have an effective organization. Now our next slide will be SD9, and it's goals, goalless versus goal-bound. Now that's about all the time I have for this podcast, so we'll talk about that in the next podcast. And remember, you can find it at westbrookstevens.com/organizational.htm. That's where the slides are. To reach me, it's Craig A. Stevens at westbrookstevens.com. And I'll see you again in the next podcast.